All right. Good morning or good afternoon, class. This is for U.S. history. And so what we're doing, this is for Wednesday's, the second uh, review of the Starr. So for the last 2 days, we've been doing Starr practice tests. So 20 or plus questions a day. And today I'm going to go over the Starr information. Now, there's a couple things to know about today in particular. First of all, you have to watch this video to get credit. And you're going, well, how do I get credit for it? Well, basically, at some point in time during this video, I'm going to give you some information. And it could be something as World War II started because of Japan. And for at least for the United States. And then you will have to put that in the comment section under this video to get credit. So it could be any time in this video that I could tell you this information. And at that particular time, I'll remind you what the information is, what you need to put in comments, but that way you have to watch the video. It's important. Obviously, we might have the Starr next week. If we do, we do. If we don't, we don't. It all depends on a lot of different things, but for the most part, it is something that we do need to prepare for. And so this week is just a preparation for it. And like anything else, you want to do well in whatever you are trying to accomplish, or goals, or test, or whatever project. So we're going to go over this. Now, the simple thing to keep in mind on all of this, though, is that they're simple test-taking skills. And we've talked about this in some of my classes already, but basically, this is a multiple choice test. And so the first thing before you do anything is you read the entire question. In most cases, or in some cases, you will actually find out that the answer to the question is in the question itself. And so your percentages get better. So you have a 25% chance of getting a question right from the beginning, because there's only 4 questions. Or 4 answers, I'm sorry. So you have 25% chance to get it right. If you read the actual answers, in most cases you can eliminate 2, so you automatically, then you have a 50% chance. Now, if you read the question very well and search for information that is relevant from the question to the 2 remaining answers, then your percentages go up even more. So the point I'm trying to make is that you're very intelligent people, and a lot of this stuff that you have heard before, you know before, but if you think through it and you think through the question, then you will be able to get the answer in a high percentage rate correctly. And so that's what you have to keep in mind when you're taking a test. It's not a time to, as soon as you get there, take a nap, or I'm not saying you can't rest during the test. It's a 4-hour test. But the thing that you need to do is you need to do your best. You need to be prepared for it. And when you're taking the test, take it to your best ability. Obviously, no one wants to retake these tests, and it's basically you have to master it. So with that in mind, make sure that you are doing the things that you need to do when it's time to take the test, which is basically taking your time and testing it properly. And so we're going to go through some of these questions, or we're going to go through these questions as we go. So hopefully you'll have some information on it from the last 2 previous days. And so I'm going to read the question. We're going to go over it. Like I said, there's about 50 questions, so it's going to take a while. At some point in time, I will tell you about the what to write in the comment section, so you get full credit for it. And so today will be a review, and we'll also have an article to read probably. And then tomorrow will be another form of testing. And then Friday, we'll probably do a review again. And then the test is scheduled for next Tuesday. And so let's continue to go and see what we come up with. I'm sorry I can't show you the actual papers. The Zoom that I was working on is not working right. So I'll hopefully have it done by the next time. But right now, I just want to go over the information more in a lecture form. and we'll go about it. So hopefully you can, as we're doing this, you can look at your information and go along and read it. So basically the first question that we had was, it's a paragraph, and it says things were quite unspeakable went on there in the packing houses. Things that were quite unspeakable went on there in the packing houses all the time and were taken for granted by everybody. Only did they not show as in the old slavery times, because there was no difference in color between master and slave. This was written by Upton Sinclair, and it's called The Jungle in 1906. And so basically, to keep in mind, first of all, that information at the very top tells you something about what is actually happening. Upton Sinclair was a person who wrote a book about the meatpacking industry, and he wrote the book about the meatpacking industry because at that particular time we didn't have sanitation like we do now. So the meatpacking industry was very, very dirty. It's corrupt. There weren't safety practices, whatever the case may be. And so he wrote this, and he wrote this book called The Jungle. And so the Jungle, basically showed you what was wrong with the meatpacking industry. And because of this, things went in place, like the FDA and stuff of that nature, that enabled us to put regulations on food or stuff that's being processed for people to eat or consume or whatever the case may be. So the question is how does this excerpt above reflect the spirit of the progressive era? And the progressive era, as we've talked in some of the classes, means to progress, to get better. So when you're talking about progressive era, the first thing, just take the first part of the word, progress. That means to get better. It's for the people to unite, to get better, for things to not to be the way they always were. And so the answer to this question, it calls attention to the problems of industrialization and rapid growth. So basically, it was showing that there was problems in this industry and that things needed to be taken care of and make sure that we fix these conditions. So that was number one. The number two was a poster, and the poster above reflect American patriotism and support for. And basically, what you had an African American or Black American, basically in a pilot outfit, and it's basically showing buy war bonds, but it's showing that we did have Black pilots in World War II. And so if you know, there was a group of them, and they were called the Tuskegee Airmen, and basically they came from this particular air base, and that was the name of it, and they were basically the pilots who flew in World War II and protected bomber planes. They were actually a very good unit, had one of the best records of all the flying units in the war. And the poster was to reflect American patriotism and support for the Black pilots, which was the Tuskegee Airmen. So that was number two. Number three, which of the following best describes the significance of Sonia Stonemeyer's career? So Sonia Stonemeyer was basically appointed to serve as the first Hispanic justice on the Supreme Court. So Sonia Stonemeyer was the first Supreme Justice on the Supreme Court. So basically, that's what you need to know if that question came up. Excuse me. She was the first Hispanic to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court, and basically, President Obama appointed her. So we didn't until recent times actually have an Hispanic female on the Supreme Court, until President Obama basically put her in place, and so that's who Sonia Stonemeyer's career, and that's who Sonia Stonemeyer is. 16 hours. The next question: 16 hours ago, an airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. The bomb had more power than 2,000 tons of TNT. It had more than 2,000 times the power blast of the British Grand Slam, which is the largest bomb ever to be used in the history of warfare. This was a press release by the White House on August 6, 1945. Which one of the following arguments was most used to justify the action described in this press release? And basically, when they dropped the bomb, they were doing this. We knew they're first they dropped it on civilian populations, which is something in wartime that you usually try not to do. You try, obviously, if it's the military is who's fighting, so you want military against military. You don't. We want to limit civilian casualties as much as possible, but when they dropped the bomb, it was after at a certain point, almost 60 million people have already died in the last 5 years of war between the European theater and the Pacific theater. And so the argument was the use of the nuclear bomb prevented further loss of U.S. life would be the answer, but it was also less loss of Japanese lives as well. Now that was the argument. Not saying that is there was multiple arguments, but that was the main one on why we would drop a bomb on a civilian population, why we'd want this war to stop at this particular time. We didn't really want to confront the island because if the Japanese were a very warrior culture, and so it was disrespectful to give up land, give up property, give up your home, whatever the case. So a lot of situations, but because of the culture, the feeling was that the Japanese would fight to the death, and they proved that in many of the battles that we already had with them, and that they would basically fight to the death to because of honor. And so the thought process was if we attacked with American soldiers or any soldiers going against the Japanese on Japan itself, that it would be a very, very bloody and devastating battles, not only for civilians but for the military as well. So the thought process was, well, if we drop this bomb, show them the type of military power that we do have, and we actually could stop the war. And we dropped 2 bombs. There was some other things that were leading to the end of the war anyways, because Japan was running out of resources, but it did seem to put an end to the war, but it opened up a whole new problem with the idea that we have now this nuclear power that is so capable of being used, and possibly in an improper way. And so there was many questions and debate whether we should have used the bomb or not. And right now, there's still only about 8 countries that have nuclear power, but it did put our whole world into a whole new light after that. Obviously, shortly after that, or several years later, not a whole lot, Russia actually got nuclear power too, and that started obviously the Cold War. All right, let's see what's next. What new technology caused the greatest number of casualties during World War One? And World War One was kind of interesting, and the answer to that is machine guns. Now, they have machine guns, poison gas, tanks, airplanes. All that was new technology. All that did apply, and that did put people into danger. But the machine guns, because of the way the war was fought and how we did trench warfare, so people were on separate battle lines, and they would go across these battle lines every now and then, and they would be able to be, you're running across an empty field, and you have machine guns from the opposite side able to leverage that entire field of battle. So basically they're just mowing people down, and so that's why so many people died in that war, when there wasn't a lot of like forward battles. There was 20 million people died in the war, but the biggest reason was because we did not know how to fight a war with the new technology that we had, and machine guns was one of the technologies. So the new technology caused the greatest number of casualties during World War One was machine guns. We're going to go to number 7. How did the conclusion of World War One affect defeated world powers such as the Germans Empire, Austro-Hungary Empire, and Ottoman Empire? So how was that affected? And so basically what happened was, because of the loss of the war to these particular powers, they basically, the empires were broken up. So you had an Ottoman Empire, and we talk, this is something we learned in world history. The Ottoman Empire lasted like over 700 years. A very, very powerful empire. It was Turkish, and they controlled a lot of different things. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, once again, an empire is a situation where you own not only, for instance, let's say Britain. Britain was a big, huge empire for a long time, and Britain owned places like I don't know if they owned, but they controlled territories, and they called them their own. Like they controlled India, they controlled other things. So, like for the so you would control not only your present place, like the Great Britain, but you would control other places like Ireland, Scotland, parts of India, parts of Africa. You would that's an empire. So, an empire is where you have multiple colonies elsewhere. And so when going to World War One, this was the fact that you had these empires that were fighting who actually lost, and because of that, because of the ending of the war and the treaties that were signed, the armistice, basically the empires were broken up. So we have very few empires left in the world. And so, but at that particular time, they were powerful empires, especially the Ottomans. The Ottomans were going for like 700 years prior to this, prior to them breaking up. So they were a very powerful empire. But they broke up because of the World War One, I'm sorry. Which factors distinguish the Vietnam War from other major wars that came before it? And basically, the thing that changed on this war was television. So this was one of the first wars that was fought that you could see information about it on the nightly news. You got to keep in mind, television wasn't something that was like today, where we have 42, 50 inches, 65 inches in every other room, or whatever the case may be. Back in the 60s, you had black and white TV. You didn't have any color TV. Color was not the format that television was put out in. It was black and white, and maybe people had one television, if you had one television. So television was just becoming the main media of what you get information besides newspapers. And so, but at the end of the night, you would watch the news and you could see what was actually happening. You could see if a battle was being fought in Vietnam. You could see the parts of the battle. You could see interviews with people who fought in the battle. So this was the first war that you actually had television. And excuse me, I'm sorry. This is the first war that you actually had television that would monitor and give you possible information every night on the war itself. So it was a big deal because it actually helped with people and their opinions on what was going on in the war. If you were talking World War II, you would see newsreels, like you go to a movie theater and you'd see a newsreel that would basically show what was going on in the war, but it would just be real clip. It wouldn't be an up-to-date, wouldn't be commentary, wouldn't be like it is today. So you just got the whatever they wanted to feed you about the war, what was going on, so on and so forth. When you started getting news channels and stuff, you started hearing both different sides of what was actually happening, and you saw the violence and you saw the other things, and then a lot of people made up their own mind on, was the war was it something we needed to be into? Obviously, we were fighting that war because of communism. We didn't want North Vietnam to take over South Vietnam and become another communist country, because we thought that would affect other countries around it, which is called the domino theory. So if one country falls to communism, the countries around it would fall. So people started predicting and to get their own ideas on how this war was and was it warranted and so on and so forth. So it's a big deal. Now you take it for granted. We see everything on TV and we see it for hours on end or whatever the case might be. But back then, that wasn't the case. All right. Let's see. Number 10. If you're looking at, based on the map, the eastern United States is mostly... And so basically they're showing a population map of 2010 population density of the United States and Puerto Rico. And the one thing that you'll notice on this map is that it has spots like little lights that are lit up or on the map or whatever the case may be that shows where the population densities are. So this is where people are living. So if you look at our country right now and you look at the population density, you will notice that the eastern part of the United States is clustered with cities and towns. And what that means is that a lot of the eastern part of the United States has a lot of population to it. You start going to the Midwest and population tends to go down. You go to the West Coast, population around California goes up, obviously. But you got to keep in mind that the eastern part of the United States is obviously where the 13 colonies were. And so that has been, growing for 250 plus years. And so when you're looking at how the population is set up in the United States, it does appear differently in certain parts of the country. Midwest is less populated. The eastern part of the United States, especially northern up to New York, Philadelphia, so on and so forth. That's where big population centers are. And then obviously, then you do have some southern populations like Texas, which is obviously one of the bigger states as well with population. And then you go to California. So, but it's basically showing that the country itself is populated with a lot of densities and a lot of cities on the eastern coast of the United States. All right, as a result of the oil embargo adopted by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which was called OPEC. So, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So, this is an organization that controls oil. In the mid-1970s, the U.S. federal and state leaders, as a result of the oil embargo adopted by the OPEC in the mid-1970s, U.S. federal and state leaders blank. And so, the answer to this one is A, instituted new regulations intended to lessen oil use and protect natural resources. So, they had an oil embargo. So there was many countries outside the United States who controlled the oil in the world. It's not so much today, but obviously in the 70s it was the Middle East. And we had oil. There was an oil embargo, means there wasn't a lot of oil. There was long lines to wait for gas and so on and so forth. So there was a problem with oil. And at this particular time, they instituted, the United States, instituted new regulations intended to lessen oil use and protect natural resources. So we use this as an opportunity to put some conservative programs in place to protect our natural resources or our land itself. And so that's what the biggest thing to take away from that is OPEC was in the 1970s, and it was an organization of nations, mostly Middle Eastern, that controlled the oil output in the world. And now today it's a lot different. We're not self-sustaining by any means, but we have one of the largest productions of oil in the world, but back then it wasn't so prevalent. Okay, let's see. So number 12, the attack upon Korea made it plain beyond all doubts that communism has passed beyond the use of subversion to conquer independent nations and will now use armed invasion and war. It has defied the orders of the Security Council of the United States issued to preserve international peace and security. In these circumstances, the occupation of the Formosa by communist forces would be a direct threat to the security of the Pacific area and the United States forces performing their lawful and necessary functions in the area. This was done by President Harry Truman, June 27, 1950. And so basically what they're talking about here, first of all, if you're going into the 1950s or something like that, you're usually talking about Cold War time period. So one thing with Cold War, obviously, is basically we were trying to contain communism, meaning we didn't want it spreading rapidly throughout the world. We wanted communism to be very limited, and they wanted the same from us. They didn't want our democracy to be everywhere. So this is the Cold War between us and Russia. And so the U.S. reactions to the events, what they're talking about, 1950s, they're talking right after World War II. Russia has power now. Russia does have a nuclear weapons, and they also basically have a situation where they're aiding countries like North Korea to become communist. So North Korea attacked South Korea, which was an ally to us, and so we got involved in a war because North Korea was trying to overtake the whole country. And once again, we were afraid of the communist domino theory that, first of all, we wanted as few communist countries as possible, but then if that country fell, then more countries around the Asian area would also fall as well too. So that is called containment. One main impact of the spread of white settlement through the Great Plains and West during the 1800s on the regional environment was, and this was so this is talking about in the 1880s, we had white settlements on the Great Plains. So we were expanding across the West, the Western expansion, so on and so forth. Because of us spreading throughout the world, throughout the country, this impacted obviously the Native Americans. And one thing that really impacted with Native Americans was the fact that it impacted the bison or buffalo. There were wild herds of buffalo that roamed freely that Native Americans used for almost every piece of a buffalo that was killed or hunted, and they used it for their culture and for their daily lives. When the Americans, or when the white settlers or immigrants started going across and expanding in Western expansion, they started killing off that source of food and resources for the Native Americans. At first, it was done just because it was natural. You'd have people coming across, they would be hunting, so on and so forth. You probably wouldn't be killing more than what you needed to eat or whatever the case may be. But after a certain point in time, when we wanted to necessarily put the Indians into the reservation and make them farmers, then a policy was set out and set forth that the buffaloes were basically hunted to basically extinction. They were trying to purposely get rid of all these animals so that the Native Americans would have to put on a new type of life, which would be farmers or whatever the case may be. And so that's what basically that question is pertaining to. Now let's go to, let's see. I'm going to some questions that I think might be more prevalent to what we have, but all right, so this one is number 16. All persons shall be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the goods, services, facilities, privileges, advantage, and accommodations of any place of public accommodation, as defined in this section, without discrimination or segregation on the ground of race, color, religion, or national origin. So this was a Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the question above, if this policy described the text, if the policy described in the text above had been enacted 10 years earlier, which events would have been unnecessary? So basically, if we had these rights a decade earlier, there would have been no reason to basically do certain type of protest. And the one protest, what they're talking here is that you are talking about persons shall be entitled to full and equal enjoyment of goods, services, facility, privileges, advantages, and accommodations. So if you look at the question within itself, even if you did not know the answer, you would know that if you looked at it, the protest at the Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. Now, why would that be an answer? Is because when you're talking about a lunch counter or the accommodations, basically in Woolworth at that particular time, if you were not white individual, then you could not eat at their counters or their main counters. Maybe they put you on the side or they put you in a section somewhere else, but in the main area, you were not allowed to eat. And if a decade earlier, things were put in play with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which says that you can't discriminate people, you can't segregate people. If I want to eat at Luby's or Wendy's, it doesn't matter what my race is. I should be allowed to sit down and eat. But they were discriminating against Black Americans by not letting them eat at the counters. And so basically, what they would do is the protesters, which was black and white, would go into Woolworth and they would sit at the counter, knowing that they were not going to be served, but they sat there anyways in a form of silent protest. And so basically, what was going on is they were either going to be arrested, they were going to cause kind of a ruckus, not them personally causing the ruckus, but people around them getting upset because they were not following what seemed to be the guidelines of the culture at that particular time. And so they called them sit-ins. So you would go someplace and you would sit there, and multiple things would happen. Either you would sit there till you got arrested. You usually would not get fed. It wouldn't be something that you would win or by any means, but it was a form of protest. Unfortunately, in a lot of the sit-ins, they did get very violent, and not by the people who were protesting, but the people who were around them, people who did not want the civil rights to be put in play, did not want did not want blacks to have the same rights as whites, whatever the case would be. Those are the people who were getting violent. It wasn't the protesters. The protesters were actually obviously a very brave thing because they knew that they were putting themselves in danger when they actually sat at those counters. And so that was kind of a scary situation for them to do. But it was something that they needed to do to try to change the world around it. And sometimes, if you talk about civil rights and you talk about that and you talk about Martin Luther King, in most civil rights leaders were all about nonviolence. It wasn't about violence. Most of the time, the violence was perpetrated on the people who were doing the protesting to get their rights, but they weren't starting a lot of this violence that was happening. The violence was being instituted upon them because people were angry and didn't want change. And so the 60s was a very, very highly charged era. And we're even seeing it today in some situations where we still have racial divides in this country. So you can imagine when 50 years ago the racial divides and how the world was set up, it was a very dangerous place. It could be for people who were protesting about getting the rights that everyone was supposed to get under the Constitution of the United States. And so, very interesting time. A lot of sadness, a lot of grief, a lot of the Martin Luther King, he was assassinated. Malcolm X, who was another leader of the of change, was assassinated. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. John F. Kennedy was assassinated. There was multiple people who were killed throughout this violent decade. So besides civil rights going on, you also had the Vietnam War. So a lot of things were happening in this era. So it was a really important era in how it shaped us and our future. Fortunately, even though one could argue that we still have racism in the United States. You could definitely argue that the 60s did put forth vital change that is continuously going on today. When they did the 64 Civil Rights Act, trying to make everything equal for everyone, and then the Voting Rights Act of 65, which was there to stop poll taxes and things like that made it easier for people to vote. They obviously, when it comes to like voting and stuff like that, the biggest concern about voting is just like now when you're seeing this election, is that we had 150 million people vote, and this was the election that we have today is highly still being protested, and I'm not saying one way or another whether that should, but the thing that you have to realize is that voting is a very powerful tool that you have in your hand. If you want change, then you do it. You can do it through voting, and each vote counts. So it's just like right now, you have different opinions of Biden. You have different opinions of Trump. If there are people who want change what Trump was doing for the last 4 years, well, you had 80 million people who came out and voted for Biden. Okay, so that could change the world or what we live in to a certain extent. In most cases, it's not going to change to the degree that people say it will. Every election, it seems to be the most defining election of our history, but it's usually not that case. But then again, you also have Trump, who got over 70 million votes, and a lot of people wanted to contain the balances that he had. So, but back then, when you had in the 60s, what they were trying to do was limit the representation of people who were the elected officials. So if you were a black individual, they tried to keep you from voting, because if you did not have the power to vote, and in certain populations where you had large black populations who could control the voting outcome of a particular place, that could mean that they would have representation that would look something like them or have something of their ideas to go with. And so people, white, not all white people, but white racists were trying to eliminate that power from black Americans. So instead of them being able to vote, they would put hindrances on them, their ability to vote. So they put a poll tax or make them take a test or do some other stuff and make it unfair for them to vote. And so that's why voting is so important, because voting can basically, excuse me, but pardon me for the sneezes. I just something in the air. I'm in a room I'm not usually in my house, and maybe it's a little bit dusty today. But that's about kind of what's going on with the voting. So keep in mind, voting is very important, and the faster when you get an opportunity, you should vote. It's your right, and you can make positive change through it. All right, which event precipitated the global war on terror? So what basically started the global war on terror? Now, don't get me wrong, the answer to this is going to be the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon in 9/11. So 9/11 was the event that precipitated the global war on terror, but there's always been a war on terror in some sense or form. Terrorism didn't start with the 2001. Terrorism was a mainstay at 2001 because of the amount of damage in the lives and the destruction that it caused to us. But prior to that, there were multiple times that we have had terrorism issues, not only in the United States but across the world. The World Trade Center, in some situations, and you guys, most of you, well, obviously you weren't even around during 9/11, but that wasn't the first time the World Trade Center was bombed, or hit with a plane, or whatever the case may be, or tried to take down. In 1991, they actually bombed one of the trade centers with filling a truck full of explosives and blowing it up in the bottom of the building. It didn't do what they wanted to. It did kill 4 people at least and injured quite a few, but terrorism has been around. Terrorism is not something new, but this put a whole new stress on the ability for terrorism to strike the United States. This is the worst terrorist attack since Pearl Harbor. And the reason Pearl Harbor was considered a terrorist attack is because Japan, in most cases, you're supposed to declare war before you attack somebody. Japan didn't declare war and just attacked us in Pearl Harbor, so it was a form of terrorism. And so that was over 2,000 people, almost 3,000 people died, similar to 9/11. So 9/11 was a situation where it got it put together unity throughout the United States. And basically at that particular time, we decided that we were under attack by terrorists throughout the world, and that put in place a whole new doctrine and a new philosophy on how we were going to handle it. So we had a war on terror at that particular, which is continued going on today. I mean, the mastermind, or one of the people, obviously behind it, was bin Laden. he was killed 10 years later. We're still have some situations where recent terrorism was some leaders and some big terrorist groups were killed recently. So it's not something that we haven't had huge, not least in our country. There has been some pretty big terrorist attacks in other countries, but we have not had as big a terrorist attack since 9/11. But it's still out there and it's still possible, and people are still trying to work through all that. So it didn't start terrorism. That didn't win it, but that's when we decided to put a new protocols in place. All right, let's go to, we're going to do one or two more, and then let's go to the GI Bill spurred economic prosperity in part by providing cheap mortgages and college education and military veterans. So the GI Bill was put in place right around the end of World War II. So basically, you had World War II where you had hundreds and thousands of people that were in the military. Okay, so you have all these people coming back from the military. You had women in factories. You had all these people working, and so the military was trying to figure out what they could do to help support some of the troops that were coming back. So you had a lot of people coming back to, an economy that was built on military action and building stuff for wars, and they had all these people getting out of the military, so they wanted to give them opportunities. So they basically gave them opportunities to get loans for houses, and it's still in effect today. It's a big thing for GI, and as many of you will know, that if you go to the military for sure for a length of time, whatever the length may be, it could be 3 years, could be 6 years, whatever the case may be, but that you also have the ability to get college paid for. So the GI Bill was put in place for military so that they could, for thanking them for their services, they could easily buy a house a lot easier than a normal individual, like no money down, so on and so forth, less interest rates, and also the ability to go to college and expand their future in other ways. And the GI Bill is still part of it, is still obviously a big part of the military today, and so that's why a lot of people go into the military, especially you obviously right after high school, because some people, if they do not have the means to pay for their education, then they go into the military, serve their time, and then the military will give them money, obviously, to follow through, go through school, pass school, so on and so forth, but that's what it's put in plan for. So, basically, we've gone through only about 20 questions. Tomorrow I might just do another for Thursday, I don't know. But basically what I want you to keep in mind is on the comment section of this, you need to put that Vietnam. On the comment section, put the word Vietnam. And Vietnam is one of the longest wars that we have fought as Americans. Now, Vietnam is a war that is one of the few wars, if the only war, that we've really we've considered it a loss. Vietnam was a war we were trying to stop communism. Obviously, we didn't understand the battle techniques and how to take over a country like that, or there was a lot of killing, there was a lot of bombing. It was over 10 years. But the war within itself was one that we could never, even though at that particular time when they had wars, they would do kill ratios. So if we killed 10 of them and they killed one of us, that would be, 10-to-1 ratio. And they would say, okay, well, we're winning. We're killing more people. Well, they stopped doing that. And in the last couple of wars, you don't hear about the kill ratio anymore, because that's not how you can really figure out if you're winning a war or not. I mean, you can annihilate a lot of bodies and a lot of people, but still not take over ground. So wars are a lot more than just about killing people. And at that particular time, that was the way they figured out if we were winning or losing. The war was the amount of bodies, that was the ratio of killed for them versus us. So we actually, that was, like I said, that was one of the few wars that we consider a loss. And we lost over 50,000 American lives at that particular war. So it was a devastating effect on us. It was a devastating effect on the nation as a whole. Lot of turmoil, obviously, during the 60s, civil rights, Vietnam. A lot of people were against the war. But what I want you to put in the comment section is Vietnam. So just put the word Vietnam in comment section. You'll get a grade for this. You'll get 100%. And I'll figure out on Thursday. I haven't figured out if we're going to do. I have some more information for you to work on, or I'm going to do a lecture, or I'll do a lecture on Friday. So do the lecture. Watch the lecture. Put Vietnam. Take this seriously. History is very important. And I'm not, and I say that obviously I'm a history teacher, but I love history. But history is very important. That's what we learn from. And then the other thing is that should be an article. I might put an article out today that you have to put some information about. It's one of those student news, and you just read the article and put some information. But I like current events. For those who you haven't jumped on yet or worked with me, I do like a lot of current events. I think it's important that you learn this kind of stuff. So thank you. I hope you're staying safe out there. I can't wait for everyone to get back to class when it's safe, and then we have an opportunity to learn in person. But while you are at home, make sure you're doing the daily checklist. Make sure you're doing your work. We're very close to the end of the semester of this class period. And so these grades really do count a lot. So do your best. If you have any questions, email me. Or whatever the case may be. I hope you're safe, you and your families, and I hope to see you real soon. Otherwise, we'll talk again in the next couple days. All right, take care. Have a great day.